Usable technology for Indian scenario. This was a talk delivered at the IEEE's Bombay section Symposium in Baramati on December 22nd, 2016. My name is Sunil. Now, what does this title actually mean? Usable technology for the Indian scenario. On the left, what you see is a human, which is circular, flexible kind of a scenario. The other thing is a computer, which is quite controlled, but it has its own idiosyncrasies. Now, one of the main things is there exists a gap between the computer and the human. When a human wants to interact with a computer, there is a certain amount of gap. So usually what happens is the human learns something which is so that he can interact with the computer. One of the things to bridge this gap is by what is called use of technology. For the time being, let us not too worry about what is technology, but if you look at the red line, what it really suggests is that a human can interact with the computer and thus reduce the gap between the human and the computer using some technology. For example, the length of the line could suggest the amount of effort that the human has to put so that he can interact with the computer. And the number of edges actually suggests how difficult it is for the human to adjust to the computer. On the other hand, a usable technology is one which has much more ease with which the human can interact with the computer. For example, the blue lines and the black dotted lines suggest usable technologies. Now the question that one could ask is there a unique technology that is usable, that exists between the human, that can bridge the gap between a human and computer? The answer is a no. The reason is that the technology actually depends on the environment in which it is being used. Now, what is this environment? It could be the scenario, or it could be the place where the human wants to interact with the computer. So before we go on, the definition of a usable technology is that it keeps humans in mind, it keeps the limitations of the technology in mind and the environment in mind, so as to bridge the gap between the human and computers. Now, the focus of my talk, while technology is very generic, will depend upon what actually I work on. So there are these activities which are being carried out at the TCS Innovations Lab Mumbai, and I'll be basically looking at those technologies which are which do take up along the lines of speech and natural language processing. Now let us look at what do I mean by technology bridging and gap. For example, this is a voice-based self-help system. This have become apparently very common today because there are these services industries which would want people to help themselves by asking queries to the system. So if you look at this particular example, what it depicts is that there is this mobile phone user to the right who has a query. He asks the query, he speaks the query. The query is actually going to the mobile service provider gateway, then to the speech recognition. It understands what the speaker has asked. Then there is the natural language processing database which gets back the query and gives it back to the user. So the technology that interacts or that enables the user, the mobile phone user, to interact with the data is the whole of the speech recognition kind of a thing. Now let's look at what I mean by usable technology. On one hand, what one could do is tell the human that he can use this particular self-help system by asking very specific questions, in the sense that he doesn't have he has to practice what he wants before he can ask the question. So that's a very constrained kind of a scenario. On the other hand, and in this constrained environment, the technology works beautifully because it knows what the human is going to ask and accordingly it can respond. On the other hand, one could have a very free kind of a scenario. In this case, have a very free language model in the speech recognition terminology, where the user can ask what he wants, and hence it's very flexible, but there is a high likelihood that the computers or the technology will mistake. So both these extremes, the constrained and the free, are not really usable, because on one hand the technology failed, on the other hand we are pushing a lot of constraint on the way the human can ask the queries. The usable one would stand somewhere in between. For example, if you had a mechanism where your system was not so restrictive of the what people can ask, and at the same time the machines were able to understand what the people or the human wanted, then you would have set up a technology, that's a speech recognition technology, which actually does make it usable. Now let's go back to another example. The second example is again in the speech terminology, and in this case I'm going to speak about the speech-based authentication. So the technology is very simple: voice biometrics, which extracts patterns from voice samples and then matches them with patterns which are already existing in the database of the same person. So you sort of speak to a person and speak to a machine, and the machine says, hey, I recognize you because your patterns match the patterns that I have about you. Now, is this kind of a scenario usable? For example, if you were to sort of remember a predefined password or a PIN, then it would be a constraint on the human. On the other hand, if there was a restriction of what you could speak or the phrase or the language, then again you would have some kind of a question on the usability. And in an Indian context, the most usable thing would be probably one that is independent and continuous, and all the time you are actually listening to, you are being authenticated. This is especially something that can avoid people changing phones within a transaction. Just look at a scenario where person A, who is the actual user of the system, speaking to the system, he authenticates himself. But in between, if there is a person B who is in bad element, comes and picks up the phone from him and does the rest of the transaction, the system would not know. So a usable technology should be one which can continuously authenticate the person behind the voice. So these are the two examples of what I would say connecting the human to the computer using voice. As I said earlier, the most important thing is to be able to use technology that suits a particular context. So if you recall, the title of the talk was Usable Technology for the Indian Context. So what is Indian context? Let's look at a few examples. For those of you who are in India, you would agree that the Indian context is as diverse as it can get in all dimensions. The number of languages that we have are tremendous. The spoken dialects are innumerable. Accents are plenty on one dimension. The written scripts are also very many. We have different environmental noises. We have temple bells ringing, mosque prayers, railway platform, roads are noisy. And there are plenty of spoken variations. Try spelling Koparapu or Eraguntla or Thangal Kunj Musalyar. You would have everyone spell it very, very differently. And being English friendly India, you would have several languages which have interplaced English words within them. So you would be speaking in more than two languages within a single sentence. There is a high disparity in the literacy levels, the economic levels. The postal addresses are just not standardized. For example, you would find something like opposite Hanuman temple, below Xerox shop, above Taj shoe center or something like that. And of all the things, we lack resources not in terms of monetary, which of course is one of them, but resources in terms of data. neatness and pollution levels are at different level, and we have several different mannerisms that go once you start living in India. You would observe them. That honking is indeed a signal, and it is not to be offended, not to be taken as an something that is a signal of you not being able to drive correctly. And of course, we are a large in population, and we have never a great traffic sense. On road, 3 lanes become 4, 5, and infinite lanes. We never follow rules. If there is a signal there, you would sort of be almost in the middle of the road. And vehicle number plates, even if you wanted to set up some kind of an automatic vehicle recognition system, it wouldn't work. For example, the big vehicle here doesn't seem to have a number plate, and the number plate here is in a very fancy one. And we have a certain level of discomfort when we have to speak with people, with machines. So these are some of the idiosyncrasies associated with the Indian scenario. Are these handleable? Of course they are. For example, these are something that help you in building solutions which are robust. For example, to attack the different languages, spoken dialects, etc., what you need to do is probably make the solutions language independent. Number of scripts, how do you manage script recognition and things like that? Again, make the scripts independent of the script. You just make it such that it looks at the fundamentals and not necessarily dependent on the languages. For building solutions which work in all environments, we have to build solutions which are robust to noise. And a couple of things like speaking in 2 different languages in one sentence and the lack of resources would show you new ways of looking at a solution. When your literacy levels are different, you would have a nice mechanism of building, looking at human computer interface designs. Even things like when three lanes are not necessarily 3 lanes, you will be looking for new approaches. So you have a lot of scope to innovate and come up with newer solutions when you think of Indian specific scenarios. And why is it that one has to look at the Indian scenario? The reason one has to look at these is because what works elsewhere does not necessarily work in a certain context, like the Indian context, or certain context requires certain specific solutions. And when there are lack of resources, what do you do? Let's look at some of the examples. For example, things that are not going to work in the Indian scenario which work elsewhere are the self-driving cars. Why they don't work? Because we drive by the horn, we don't follow rules, we never have lane traffic, things like that. Automated postal sorting, this is something that seems to work elsewhere in the world, but in India it doesn't work because of the number of scripts that you have, the not necessarily using pin code and things like that. Can we imagine unmanned toll plazas and petrol pumps in India? Probably not, because we are a little different. And speech-based self-help IVR solutions also wouldn't work because of the degree of languages, the noises and things like that. And maybe there are several India-specific solutions that people have come up with. For example, Clash on Delivery is something that the retailers never thought of elsewhere, but in India that was the mode of transaction, one of the payment options. Caller tunes or missed tones. Online stores, you wouldn't find them in brick and mortar, but in India you would need, because we want to feel something before we buy. Shared cab probably is a concept that is very specific to India. And lack of resources, machine learning, corpus or something that are not available. How do we build corpus so that we can use it? So these are some of the examples from the talk. Now let's dive into the snippets. So I would have I've chosen only a couple. Agent assist is a mechanism that is actually used, was built by the TCS Innovations Lab Mumbai specifically for the Indian context. For example, the call centers in India need people, agents in India, to speak to customers abroad. One of the main reasons why there is a customer dissatisfaction is the speed at which the agents in India speak. So this is a small module which actually was built to compute the speaking rate of the agent in real time. So this particular technology helps people, the agents, to realize his speaking rate in real time, so that if he's going too fast, he can reduce his speaking rate so as to make himself much more comprehensible and hence increase the thing. So let's look at a small video.
Good morning, welcome to Photon. This is Maria, how may I assist you?
Yeah, good morning. I'm calling from Calcutta.
Yes, sir.
So this was a speedometer which was demonstrating the speaking rate of the agent. So the idea was the agent would look at the speaking rate and then control his speaking rate. If he was going fast or if he was speaking slow, he would be going faster. Now if you now the Indian in the Indian context, this is what was required, but this had to work for different languages. So we had to think of a mechanism by which we could make it work for different languages. So the way we went about doing this is to sort of count the number of syllables that were spoken. Syllables are representative of high energy segments in speech. You computed number of syllables per second, and then using the number of syllables which convert into a word, you figured out the number of words per second and then spit out the speaking rate. So this was a very India specific solution that was built. The other thing was a visual subtitles. I will not go into the details, but specifically the idea is to build a solution which can enable people with hearing impairment to be able to gauge what is the what is being told in the video. The Indian context in this is that we had to make this for different languages. So the way we did this was to compute the identify the phones in the spoken speech and then convert each of the phone into a visual representation, so that independent of the language you were able to convert the speech in the video into a visual effect. I'll just show you one demonstration and then for example, if you were to look at let us say English grammar.
Simple present tense. Subject. Plus.
What you see in this box is a visual representation of what the person in the video is speaking. So the idea is while the one of the ways of for a hearing impaired person to make out is to look at the lips of the speaker. In this case, since the teacher is not facing the camera, it is impossible for the person who is hard of hearing to make out what she is saying. So the visual representation, what you see on in the small box, is supposed to sort of help you. Okay, so to conclude, from the Indian context, the problems to be solved are in abundance, and each of them is a big challenge. This requires a trigger, a problem statement, requires an understanding of what is to be done, and of course it requires the ability to address them. So it requires sensitiveness, it requires expertise, and it requires one to visualize what the problem is. Let's look at a small example.
लेना ही था। मेरी बेकरारी ने मुझे आविष्कारी बना दिया। पर प्यार को भी आविष्कार का सहारा लेना ही पड़ता। आविष्कार ही मेरी नूर का नूर है, नई खोज ही मेरी जिंदगी का जरूर। माई टेक्नोलॉजी।
So the whole idea is technology has to be scenario specific, and so it doesn't matter in what area you have to use it, but it requires sensitiveness and expertise to solve it. So for those of you who are in India, I think you are in the best place for you to be able to come out with innovative and great solutions which can address problems that are India specific. So my advice to all of you who are out there in India and want to do something, dream really big, pick the most difficult problems, solve them passionately, and of course it'll make a great difference. So solutions need to be conceptualized, ideated, improvised, innovated, and need to be built in India. Usable technology for the Indian scenario. And I hereby acknowledge the team sitting behind me. Any queries, I'm more than happy to take. Thank you very much.